The Metroid series is up there as one of my favourite series Nintendo has ever been involved with. I was introduced to the series' heroine, Samus Aran, in the very first Super Smash Bros. Game as a kid, but it wasn't until I played Prime back in 2003 when I played a Metroid title for the first time. And, well, I didn't get far. Afterwards, I tried out the very first Metroid game on the NES cassette design that was on the Game Boy Advance, but I got lost and gave up. It wasn't until I played Metroid Zero Mission on the Game Boy Advance where I completed my very first Metroid title and fell in love with the franchise. I even went back to finish Prime and played through most of the games since. One of my first videos I ever uploaded onto YouTube was a Let's Play on Zero Mission, and no, you cannot watch it. I deleted it ages ago, as God intended. I also talked about the same game and why it was a perfect remake, as part of an open collaboration with fellow YouTuber Reaper Ren's Metroid project in celebration of Dread's release, a project I was happy to be a part of. The Metroid series, despite not being the first Metroidvania, that being the Sharp X1 and its name, Brain Breakers, is often considered a pioneer of the genre, which influenced plenty of titles in some shape or form. While our leading lady Samus isn't the very first video game heroine, she is one of the most iconic and she deserved it, being a stoic badass, influenced by the main lead of the Alien movies, Alien Replicant. To share my love of the series, I want to tackle most of the series in release order, with this video talking about the first two.
銀河連邦司令メトロイドを破壊せよ。
地底深く広がる迷路要塞に宇宙征服の野望が渦巻く。
行け宇宙戦士サムス。
ファミリーコンピューターディスクカードにアクション&迷路ゲームメトロイド。やればやるほどディスクシステム。
The very first Metroid game was originally released on the Famicom Disk System in 1986 in Japan, which featured a save system and a better sound quality. It was then released on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987 in the US and 1988 in Europe, which, unlike its Japanese counterpart, removed the save feature in exchange for a password feature. The game was developed by Nintendo R&D 1, run by Gunpei Yokoi of the Game Boy fame, as well as Intelligent Systems, the latter known for the Fire Emblem and Advance Wars series. Metroid was inspired by Ridley Scott's Alien, especially Heitor Gaida's artwork on the series, and was meant to stand out from Mario's whimsical child-friendly approach, targeting a more audience in mind, like the films, as seen in the artwork by Samus's creator Hiroji Toyotake. Gunpei Yokoi wanted to make something different that would stand out compared to the more linear arcade-style games prior, hence how it became the non-linear adventure series we know and love. The first Metroid was in development for about 10 months, however the majority of the team were pretty new at making games for TV, as a lot of them only worked on the Game & Watch titles, a group of LCD handheld games, so there was quite a struggle, and it definitely shows if you ever played Metroid. It wasn't until Yoshio Sakamoto, one of the few from the beginning still involved with the franchise, and Intelligent Systems who jumped on board to help with the technical side of things, that the game became playable. With how early this game came out in the console's lifespan, the scope for this kind of game and how inexperienced the developers were, the first Metroid game is quite a mess. Before I get to the issues I have with the game, I do want to point out what I liked about it. The title screen is one of my favourites on the console, composed by the talented Hirokazu Hip Tanaka, known for many early generation Nintendo music such as Super Mario Land, Kid Icarus, and the first two Mother games. NES music was limited, which often used pretty quickly. 8-bit music is not something I would listen to outside of its source material, with a few exceptions. But I would say that Metroid is one of my favourite OSTs for the console, and how well it enhances the experience of being on a hostile planet. You have your triumphant music like the ending credits and Brinstar, but I love it's minimal on purpose to make it feel you are alone on this isolated hostile planet. Even if the NES sound wasn't as great as the Famicom Disk Systems, it still gets the same feel across, and in some ways I prefer some of the sound effects in the NES version. Hip Tanaka mentioned in a Gamma Sutra interview that sound designers in many studios started to compete with each other by creating upbeat melodies for game music. The pop-like Yiften tunes were everywhere. The industry was delighted, but on the contrary, I wasn't happy with the trend, because those melodies weren't necessarily matched with the taste and atmospheres that the games were originally had. The sound design for Metroid was, therefore, intended to be the antithesis for that trend. I had a concept that the music for Metroid should be created not as game music, but as music the players feel as if they were encountering a living creature. I wanted to create their sound without any distinctions between music and sound effects. The image I had was, anything that comes out from the game is the sound that game makes. He later adds that I believe I succeeded in emphasizing the characteristics of Metroid by synchronizing the theme of the music with the theme of the gameplay, where a player must escape from an underground maze. I wouldn't listen to the majority of the soundtrack in my spare time, with the exception of the title and ending theme, but I feel that Tanaka succeeded in what he wanted to do with many of its classic tunes, such as the title theme, Brinstar, and Kraid, being retooled in many future titles, as well as games like Smash Bros. Space was quite a popular setting in the early days of video games, as not much effort was needed for the backgrounds to get believable, making the sprites easier to see. Sometimes you get dots in the background to mimic stars. The combination of the music and the lack of a colored background enhances Metroid's dark cavern settings of isolation perfectly well, especially if you are playing in the dark. The intro is a lot more dynamic compared to Nintendo's previous titles, with a black background and static fonts. The game addresses in the style of a video transceiver to kill the Metroid and the Mother Brain on planet Zebeth. Despite the bad translation, the intro gives you a brief detail on the general objective in such a neat way. While the title briefly describes what you are supposed to do, the instruction manual gives you what the story is about. In the year 20S5 of the Space Cosmos, the Galactic Federation was founded by many alien races that formed bonds communicating with one another with trade-ins and the like. The problem was that the space pirates proved to be a problem raiding spaceships, so the Galactic Federation formed the Galactic Federation Police. However, there weren't much of a help, so the Federation called in bounty hunters to stop them and other big threats. Many years later, the space pirates attacked an unknown space station to steal a mysterious deadly creature from planet SR-388. The space pirates tend to multiply this deadly creature, dubbed the Metroid, and then use them to take over the galaxy. The Federation discovered the pirates' location on planet Zebus. However, the Federation was no match for the pirates' forces, so they sent in the bounty hunter Samus Aran to wipe out the Metroid, Mother Brain, and the space pirates. They mentioned that Samus is a cyborg who is able to absorb the enemy's powers, and a man, which anyone who vaguely knows about the series knows it's wrong, but her gender identity was kept as a secret during the first game. She's also no Mega Man. The space pirates besides Reggie are also absent in this game, and weren't introduced in-game till the 16-bit generation. I do like how the members of the Federation in the manual are a mixed race of aliens, which sadly seems to be nothing but humans in future titles. I would like to see a mixed race of the Galactic Federation aliens in the future. I want to mention that I enjoy instruction manuals, especially ones in colour. I do find these Chibi Samus artworks to be cute. Writing stories for video games back during the 80s were pretty limited, so to get around this, the cartridges came with instruction manuals that covered the story, the world, and the characters, and how the game functions. What's pretty cool about the instruction manual is that they reference a couple of things from future installments, like the Space Pirates and the Metroid's home planet SR-388, so I'm wondering if the team had things building up for future titles. The goal is to find and kill the Metroid, and destroy Mother Brain, and to do this, Samus needs to defeat the two bosses, Kraid and Reggie, but other than that, the world is your oyster. Even with the first installment, the series establishes player expression and speedrunning by rewarding the player with a sexy lady in a bikini waving at you if you beat the game as fast as possible. You are free to tackle the bosses, it's usually the last one in any order, as long as you have the skill and the right equipment on you. You can get a suit upgrade in the first area that gives you a higher defense, but it's locked behind a tall pathway. You can go to Norfair later on to get the high jump boots to get across, but you can get it earlier either by grabbing an ice beam and freeze an enemy in the room, or if you execute it at the right time, can jump after you set off a bomb. While the pretty lady waving at you might not be reward in this day of age, the satisfaction of finding new ways to explore, looking for the quickest route possible, or even doing a mini-est run is its own reward for some, which the series wears as a badge of honor. I do like getting lost from time to time, and I admit I do get lost pretty easy in any game, but if I get stuck for a long period of time, due to how cryptic the environments are, or how similar the areas are, I can get annoyed, which the first game does in spades in my first couple of playthroughs. I have played this game numerous times in recent memory, especially since I had this retrospective planned a while back, so I didn't get lost as much. But I still got annoyed with how samey some of the areas looked, especially when travelling through trade. A lot of these rooms are practically copied and pasted, making it hard to see where I was. Maps didn't exist until Super, so it can be incredibly easy to get lost. There is some sort of map in the manual, however that hardly covers anything. I believe that either the designers had the intention of having you draw out your own map, supposedly being part of the fun, or they probably didn't have time to add one. Maybe they didn't add one on purpose to make the game last a little longer for little old Timmy. I know that this is probably just a me thing, as there is someone who thinks having no map enhances the experience of being isolated on a planet and discovering new things as they play, but with the repeated rooms and cryptic ways to proceed, it became annoying during my earlier runs. Apparently in the dual stream Play Choice arcade machine version, the game did come with a basic map. The first item you get is the morph ball that allows you to travel through claustrophobic spaces, and a bit later you discover an unlimited supply of bombs that can blow up walls. One of the earliest rooms you find has cracked blocks, so new that you can break them. However, there are some walls and floors that yet got any other tiles that yet unbreakable that can be destroyed. It just causes you to waste time to go into ball mode and bomb everything to see if there's anything worth passing through. While future titles do this too, no IEs are mostly for optional stuff. Here it's mandatory to progress. With the internet being everywhere now, it's easy to negate these issues, however that can be said with any other game. What the internet doesn't save is how death works. Samus starts out with only a measly 30 health points out of the default 99, but can get upgrades toward energy tanks to increase how much damage she can take. Sadly, if she dies, which will happen for newcomers, she always starts out with 30 health points. And with how stingy enemies drop health, it can be a slog to get back to full health. Oh, and the health you get from enemies is so minimal, which just wastes precious time. The developers did have spawn points for enemies, but this isn't enough to justify the grind. Despite being a walking arsenal, her move check in her first adventure has much yet to be desired. She cannot crouch, can only shoot in front of her or upwards, and she needs a beam upgrade or missiles to fire at a decent range. She does get a tool like the wave beam that has a wider range and the ice beam that can freeze enemies in place, but beam upgrades don't stack, which is odd considering if you put the Narpa sword password, she is able to fire a beam that has the property of both. Don't bother with the wave beam as the Metroids in the final area are only weak to the ice beam. Thankfully there are 2 ice beam locations in the entire game, so if you do grab the wave instead, you can easily swap it out before the final encounter. Fighting enemies early on can be a hassle, consider the size of them, the lack of tools Samus has, and how much damage stacks up. Enemies can even hit you during door transitions where you are defenseless. It's unfortunately not like Zelda 1 where enemies will vanish as you enter the next room. Thankfully, once you do get some upgrades, the game becomes a bit easier, especially if you pick up the Sewer Cat that can demolish enemies every time you spin jump. Though with how the frame rate turns from time to time eating your inputs, you aren't probably going to execute it all the time. This is especially the case in the final area of Tyrian. I have no idea why the series is called Metroid, as those are the least terrifying things about Tyrian. The donut-shaped enemies toward Rinkers are the main threat. Throughout the adventure you can get a bunch of missile packs that are vital in defeating the final boss. However, the final boss is barricaded by walls that can regenerate and can only be destroyed by a number of missiles fired. In the final room, multiple Rinkers fly everywhere, letting get in your way, taking hits for the walls, and can cause heavy knockback. Not to mention the Sheldon in this room that eats up your inputs, thanks to everything being thrown in. Turrets are also here to get in your way. If you die here, you have to go all the way back to the beginning of Turian and do it all again. I remember spending more time trying to beat the final boss than the rest of the game in one of my playthroughs. The very first Metroid was certainly ahead of its time, being the foundation of what the series will evolve to and inspire many games afterwards. However, I don't think it's a good game, only worth playing to see where the series started and to see where the Metroidvania genre began. With how ambitious the first game was, and how limited the NES was when making this type of game, I'm surprised how well Metroid transitioned to the Game Boy, a much weaker console designed to play on the go. I shouldn't be surprised though, as unlike the NES, it was made by the same people who created the Game Boy, Nintendo R&D 2.
Hi, Game Boy! アメリカで人気抜群のアクションソフトメトロイド2を紹介しよう。あのメトロイドがぐーんとパワーアップしてアイテム充実、敵キャラだって最高にエキサイティング。ゲームボーイソフトメトロイド2。
メトロイドおもろいど。
Metroid II Return of Samus was released in 1991 in North America and 1992 in Japan and Europe, and was developed by the same team who created the original. The Game Boy was already 2 years old by this point, and by the people who already made a bunch of games for the console and knew the machine from the inside out, so the game gets technically impressive for the handheld. The Game Boy Color wasn't out until many years later, so the team had to work with the actual color and look for other ways to make the characters and the enemies stand out, while making sure you weren't getting caught off guard, which I think they succeeded for the most part. Despite being weaker than the NES, the sprites are well detailed, from the mini-bosses to Samus herself. She even has different sprites when facing in different directions. With the actual color, the pink Varia suit was replaced with shoulder pads that became her iconic look throughout the series. The actual color may be a turn-off for some, but with the likes of the Super Game Boy and emulation with built-in color editors, this is a non-issue. Plus, I don't think anyone in the current year is going to bring their Game Boy out in public. The backgrounds are mostly empty with some added detail in some areas, but I think with the underground cavern settings, I think it's fine. No, I wish the game had more variety. While Metroid 2 gets better than its predecessor, the music took a nosedive. Composer Ryoji Yoshitomi attempted to go in the same direction as Hip Tanaka, focusing on more ambient sounds, and unfortunately it doesn't work for the Game Boy. There are some exceptions, like the first area being like a classic 8-bit video game store, but the other tracks took me out of the experience, mostly coming off as rough noises. It's the same as Ryoji Yoshitomi has compared some neat tracks for the Tiny Brick, like the Warrior Land games. After wiping out the Metroids on Zebras, Samus is tasked to wipe out the entire species on planet SR-388, after a failed attempt by the Galactic Federation. In the previous game, the Metroids were the hunters, but in the sequels are now the prey, and you are the hunter. The goal is marked on the bottom part of the screen of how many Metroids you have to eliminate, and if you pause the screen, it shows how many are left in the area. While this game also doesn't have a map, I didn't have much of a difficult time navigating, as besides the game being as large as the original, is mostly straightforward. The only time I got annoyed when traveling was in this one particular room where it was pitch black and had to rely on my spider ball and bombs to see if I was in the right direction. There is some leeway on where you can go, as I missed a couple of power-ups and a mini-boss in my recorded playthrough, but I didn't have much of a difficult time to see where I was going. Each area has a certain amount of Metroids to kill, and once you meet the requirement, an earthquake happens to let you know that you can progress. Unfortunately, even with the short time, as well as the occasional variations of Metroids, it gets repetitive pretty quickly. The Alphas and Gammas are easy as pie, just fire a number of missiles at them, but the Zetas and the Metas can be tough to fight, since the Zetas try to fly behind you, making it hard to fire, and the Metas can take a lot of hits. Thankfully, most of these bosses go down pretty quickly, and there aren't that many Metas in the game. There are 2 unique bosses to fight, one of them being complete optional, and the other being the final boss, with the latter being a tough but fun fight that has more than one way to defeat it. Samus has all of her kit from the previous installment, with some like the Morph Ball being available right from the start, and now has plenty more to add to her arsenal. The Plasma and Spacer Beams mark their first appearance. The Plasma is a single light shot that does a lot of damage, and the Spacer covers more area, making it easier to hit enemies. However, beams still don't stack up, so I mostly kept with the Ice Beam that is yet again a necessity in the final area. Thankfully, you can grab an Ice Beam just before you enter the last area. The real highlights come from the Spring Ball that allows you to jump while in Morph Ball mode, the Spider Ball which allows Samus to travel across the walls, and the Space Jump which allows her to fly across the screen. The Space Jump is very useful around the end of the game, however it's rough to control as sometimes it felt like my inputs didn't register. If you get hit by an enemy while space jumping, you cannot jump again and will drop down, and it did become annoying when I needed it to go up. The star of the show is the ability to crouch. Yes, Samus can now crouch, and it only took her till the second game to get that ability, which makes it a lot easier to hit the smaller enemies. Not just that, but Samus can also fire downwards while in midair, making it easier to hit enemies below you. I assume this was added due to the vastly smaller screen, so you don't get jumped by an enemy. There are many improvements from the previous game, as Samus now starts with 99 health as opposed to 30, starts out with 30 missiles, and the most important, multiple save stations, which if you die, you will recover with the same amount of health and ammo you had when you saved. This was probably due to being on the Game Boy, and the developers assumed they would be playing something like this during a train or car ride. While health pickups are still a bit picky, Metroid 2 introduces recharge stations that refill your health and ammo to negate the grind issue from the previous game. I was pleasantly surprised with how well Metroid 2 stood out after hearing it was the black sheep during the 2000s era on the internet. So it's not the same caliber as the later games, but it's a vast improvement over the original, besides the soundtrack. Despite hearing that word used around this game 20 odd years ago, it's an integral part of the series story, being a catalyst for future events. Skip over this segment if you want. Despite wiping out 99% of the Metroid population, she spares a newborn Metroid, and this decision alone changes how the story evolves into. If Samus chose to destroy this creature, then later events would either never happen or be completely different. It's also a totally different ending to what we know from the series, as instead of explosions, we instead take a more somber walk back to the ship with the baby, and despite not having a single word of dialogue, this is such a great ending. I used to play a lot of games on the Game Boy as a kid, and I have to say this might be one of the best games on the console. I'm not sure if this is a must play, but I don't think it would hurt to at least try it out. I wasn't really into the first game, but I respect it for what it is, and its jealousy inspired many beloved gems afterwards, and by the second game, they were really improving on the Metroidvania formula. But it wasn't until the next game that they perfected it. I really enjoyed this genre, and I would love to know what are some of your favourite Metroidvania games you played. Besides any Metroid game I played, I would probably have to pick Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. When I catch on this series again, I will be uncovering one of the most beloved Super Nintendo classics ever with Super Metroid.